Since man first set out to sea in ships, piracy has been a constant threat to commerce and personal security. As technology evolved, so did the methods and effectiveness of all seafarers, and pirates were no exception. During the period known as the Golden Age of piracy, many men and even a few women became notorious, even legends in their own lifetime, due to their activities. One man became larger than life due to his ruthless application and reputation of plying his trade, and was the most wanted man in the New World. But was that fair? Who was Blackbeard? How and why did he become a pirate? How effective was he? Why is he perhaps the most famous pirate in history? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Today, the name Blackbeard brings to mind piracy at its greatest point in history. Almost anyone you may ask will know the name, but let's see who the man really was. Edward Teach was born around 1680, possibly in Gloucestershire, Bristol, England, and nothing is really known about his early life. It is believed that he was one of at least two children of Captain Edward Thatch, Sr., a sailor, and his first wife, Elizabeth Thatch. The family relocated to a plantation in Jamaica and lived as a respectable family near Port Royal, known as St. Jago de la Vega. Edward Jr.'s actual name has been given as Edward Thatch, Thack, or Thatch, with different spellings. But since pirates rarely use their given names, his true identity may never be known. Blackbeard was believed to have been commissioned as a British privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession of 1701 to 1713, and the name Blackbeard the Pirate was not even known until 1716, when he began that career. After the war was over, most privateers lost their commissions and had to find other work. Blackbeard fell back on what he knew best. Blackbeard had served on a Royal Navy vessel, the HMS Windsor, in 1706 under the name of Thatch when he became a privateer. He started operating from Kingston, Jamaica, and was married to an unknown woman who supposedly died, but they had at least one daughter named Elizabeth, who married a Dr. Henry Barham in 1720. And Blackbeard's sister, also named Elizabeth, married a man named John Valasqueur in Jamaica in 1707. Following his release from service, he joined the crew of Benjamin Hornigold, one of the most feared pirates of the Caribbean. On July 3, 1715, a hurricane on the coast of Florida destroyed 11 Spanish treasure ships, scattering treasure all along the coastline. According to the records, the governor of Jamaica commissioned Thatch, meaning Blackbeard, and Hornigold to recover it for them. Hornigold and Blackbeard were successful, and Hornigold soon gave Blackbeard his own ship. With each pirate captain in his own ship, they were able to engage and capture more ships, and for a full year they wreaked a lot of havoc until Hornigold retired and accepted a pardon in early 1717. That was when Blackbeard captured a French merchantman and converted it into a 40-gun warship, which he named Queen Anne's Revenge, which became his flagship as he raided coasts of Virginia, the Carolinas, and in the Caribbean islands. Like most pilots, Blackbeard was a very shrewd businessman. He had to be. And to be successful as a pirate, he had to master the art of leadership. He knew how to recruit and keep qualified men, intimidate his enemies, and use his fearsome reputation to his best advantage. Blackbeard was also a skilled tactician and preferred to avoid fighting whenever possible, relying upon cunning and skill to achieve his ends. However, like most pirate leaders, he and his men were deadly and effective if the situation warranted. One of the most extraordinary and indeed strange relationships was Blackbeard's connection to pirate Stede Bonnet. Bonnet knew nothing about ships or even being a sailor, and even less about fighting and commanding leadership. His background was also strange for a pilot. He came from a very wealthy landowning family in Barbados and heir to a large estate. Being wealthy, he paid for a ship to be built, which he christened Revenge, and fitted her out as if he were going to be a pirate hunter. But the minute he was out of port, he raised the black flag and began looking for prizes. Stede Bonnet's lack of experience at sea on all of the required levels saw his ship crippled after a battle against a stronger ship. Bonnet, who had been wounded, and his remaining crew brought the damaged Revenge back to port between August and October 1717. Bonnet's incompetence saw his crew almost mutiny, so once in port, the pirates on board the Revenge requested that Blackbeard, also in port, take command. Seeing that even though damaged, the Revenge was a great and well-built ship, Blackbeard agreed. Bonnet remained on board, reading his books and walking the decks in his dressing gown. Blackbeard, now with 2 good ships, began hunting for prey in the Caribbean, Florida, Carolinas, and Virginia coast. On November 17, 1717, Blackbeard captured the large French slave ship La Concorde, which he converted into a frigate mounting the 40 guns. This was the ship he renamed Queen Anne's Revenge. La Concorde's crew were transferred to 2 of Blackbeard's smaller sloops, and they sailed for Martinique. Blackbeard may have even recruited some of their slaves and even crew members, which was customary, and this may be where he obtained his personal servant and closest confidant, Black Caesar, a freed slave. Those who declined the offer to become a pirate were left on the island and later recovered by the returning crew of the Mauvais Rencontre. One of the remaining sloops Blackbeard gave the French. But Queen Anne's Revenge was a powerful ship, and also fast, so it became his flagship. He then had 3 ships and over 150 pilots. This is when Blackbeard became famous throughout the Caribbean and the New World colonies. The French, Spanish, and English all knew him by his sobriquet and reputation, which was somewhat inflated, which grew with every passing month. Standing over 6 feet tall and broadly built, he also began his own brand of psychological warfare. One of his methods was to dress outlandishly, wearing a fur cap or a wide-brimmed hat, high black leather boots, and a long black coat. He also had a modified bandolier sling with 6 pistols fitted into it for easy access. He also wore colored ribbons in his beard and smoking rope ends that created a mystique of the supernatural. As with all pirates, Blackbeard used fear and intimidation, preferring his enemies surrender without a fight and without risking his ships and crews. This method served several purposes, such as showing his crew that he was smart and not willing to throw their lives away. It also showed that he preserved the valuable cargoes that could have been lost should a ship be sunk, and the captured ships were included in Blackbeard's ever-growing fleet, making him even more effective. Also, unlike many pirates, despite his reputation, if the ship surrendered without a fight, Blackbeard would take the cargoes and often let the ship leave peacefully unless it was a ship that he could use. At that point, he would drop the crew off at a specific location or transfer them to a smaller ship. As with all the major pirates, Blackbeard had his own personalized flag depicting a white, horned skeleton representing death, holding a glass making a toast to the devil, and a spear piercing a red heart on a black background. The speared heart meant that no quarter would be asked or given should a ship not surrender, and that alone was probably part of his great success. Blackbeard was soon back at it and placed his lieutenant Richard in command of Bonnet's ship Revenge. In November, near St. Vincent, he attacked the large merchantman Great Allen. But the merchant ship decided to fight. But after a duel of cannons, the ship surrendered and was moved closer to the shore. Blackbeard disembarked her crew and emptied her cargo holds, and then burned and sank the vessel. This encounter became very well known. The Boston Newsletter published the story of the battle and stated that Blackbeard was the commander of a French ship of 32 guns, a brigantine of 10 guns, and a sloop of 12 guns. On December 5, 1717, Blackbeard ships boarded the merchant sloop Margaret off the coast of Crab Island near Anguilla. The ship's captain, Henry Bostock, and his crew were guests of the pirates for about 8 hours as their sloop was ransacked. Captain Bostock and his crew were returned to the Margaret and allowed to continue. When the Margaret returned to St. Christopher Island, Bostock filed a sworn report to the governor, Walter Hamilton. His report detailed what Blackbeard and his crew had said during their brief captivity, that they had destroyed several other vessels, and that Blackbeard commanded a sloop and a large French Guineaman, Dutch-built, with 36 cannons and a crew of 300 men. His report also stated that Blackbeard's ships were headed to Hispaniola to ambush a Spanish fleet, which they believed carried the garrison payroll. Bostock also claimed that Blackbeard had questioned him about the movements of local ships, but also that he had seemed unsurprised when Bostock told him of an expected royal pardon from London for all pirates. Bostock also gave the first recorded description of Blackbeard as a tall, spare man with a very black beard which he wore very long, which was where his nickname originated. In the late part of 1717 and early part of 1718, Blackbeard and Bonnet went south to raid Spanish ships off the coast of Mexico and Central America, where the Spanish were well aware of the great devil who attacked their ships. Their expedition paid off, and in April 1718, Blackbeard had captured several ships and around 700 crewmen when they arrived in Nassau to split up the plunder. Then Blackbeard sailed north to Charlestown, modern-day Charleston, South Carolina, in April 1718 and patrolled right outside the harbor, capturing any ships that tried to enter or leave and held the crews and passengers for ransom. The local population, knowing that Blackbeard was offshore, relented, and when he sent messengers into town and claimed they wanted ransoms for the prisoners and medicines for the crews, all of which were delivered, Blackbeard and his ships left a week later. On June 10, 1718, Blackbeard planned to careen his ships and scrape their hulls, but Queen Anne's Revenge hit a sandbar off Ocracoke, North Carolina, and he transferred his loot to another ship. The impact had cracked the mainmast and damaged many of the structural timbers. Also, the sloop Adventure, commanded by Israel Hands, also ran aground, and both vessels were damaged beyond repair, leaving only Stede Bonnet's ship, the Revenge, and the captured Spanish sloop for use. On June 13th, he marooned most of his men on a small island that was visible from the mainland. They were rescued and Blackbeard set sail for South Carolina. Upon reaching Charlestown again, he learned that Woodes Rogers had left England with a fleet with orders to hunt down all pirates. Blackbeard then sailed northward along the Atlantic coast, reaching Topsail Inlet in North Carolina. Blackbeard also considered the option of a pardon and possibly retiring. In fact, he was believed to have married a local woman in Bath, North Carolina in 1718. What was apparently discussed among the pirates was the offer of the king's pardon, which was available to all pirates who surrendered on or before September 5, 1718. The catch was that immunity was offered only against crimes committed before January 5th. This stipulation meant that Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard could still be hanged for their actions at Charlestown, but most of the provincial authorities could waive those actions and issue the pardons. Well, to test the waters, Stede Bonnet surrendered to Governor Charles Eden in Bath, North Carolina, and he was given a pardon. He then returned to Beaufort to collect his ship, the Revenge, and what remained of his crew, where he planned to sail to St. Thomas to receive a privateer's commission, as war with Spain was looming. Blackbeard then arrived in Bath right after Bonnet received his pardon and left, which was ironically later revoked unknown to Bonnet. Blackbeard and Eden had made a secret deal, realizing that together they could both get very rich, with Blackbeard being the pirate collecting the loot and Eden giving him legal protection. Blackbeard's pirates captured the French merchant ship Rose Emily, loaded with cocoa and sugar. They took the ship to Bath, North Carolina, and claimed they had found it abandoned, and they shared the profits from the sales with Governor Eden. Eden had officially licensed Blackbeard's ship, Adventure, as a war prize, so Blackbeard and his men could safely anchor in a nearby inlet on Ocracoke Island, from which they could attack ships. But when Bonnet arrived, he discovered that Blackbeard had stripped his vessel of guns, powder, shot, food, and water, and had marooned 25 of his crew, which Bonnet rescued. Infuriated, Bonnet set out for revenge but was unable to find Blackbeard. Bonnet and his crew returned to piracy, and they were captured on September 27, 1718 at the mouth of the Cape Fear River in North Carolina. All but 4 were tried and hanged in Charlestown. Blackbeard then settled in Bath and supposedly married the daughter of a local plantation owner, although no proof exists that he married anyone at all. What is known was that since war was coming again, Eden gave Blackbeard permission to sail to St. Thomas. Blackbeard, now using the name Teach, sought a commission as a privateer and took his older crew with him aboard the Adventure. For some reason lost to history, he had returned to piracy that August, and in the same month, the governor of Pennsylvania issued an arrest warrant for him. Blackbeard captured 2 French ships in the Caribbean, transferring one crew to the other ship and taking the remaining ship back to Ocracoke. When he returned in September, he told Governor Eden that he had found the French ship at sea, deserted. A Vice Admiralty court was quickly convened, presided over by Tobias Knight and the Collector of Customs. The ship was judged as a derelict found at sea, and of its cargo, 20 hogsheads of sugar were awarded to Knight and 60 to Eden. Teach and his crew were given what remained in the vessel's holds. During this interlude, Blackbeard stayed at his preferred location at Ocracoke Inlet, where he could see ships easily. While there, Blackbeard saw the ship of pirate Charles Vane, who had refused the offer of a pardon offered by Woodes Rogers. Vane managed to evade the English pirate hunters. He was also pursued by Blackbeard's former commander, Benjamin Hornigold, who now operated as a commissioned pirate hunter. Vane wanted Blackbeard to join him in the open piracy trade in the Caribbean, but his deal with Eden was too good to let go, but Vane understood. Teach and Vane spent several nights on the southern tip of Ocracoke Island, accompanied by such notorious figures as Israel Hands, Robert Deal, and Calico Jack. It was at this time, when legend has it, that Blackbeard married a young woman in Bath and had several children. This story was resurrected several times, and that may or may not be true, but he and his pirates provided the town with cash, black market goods, and manpower. The pirates had a safe haven, and Eden had protection and a steady revenue stream. But problems arose due to the local businesses having the competition of pirates operating both legitimate businesses as well as raiding the ships they relied upon for their livelihood, and then selling that merchandise back to the businesses at an inflated rate. The more prominent and well-connected business owners appealed to Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia, who agreed to help. He didn't like Eden anyway. 2 British warships were anchored in the Chesapeake Bay as Spotswood hired 57 of those men and put them under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard. In November 1718, Maynard was also given 2 light sloops, the Ranger and Jane, shallow draft ships that could navigate the treacherous shallow reefs and sandbars of North Carolina. The hunt was on. On November 22, 1718, Maynard's ships located Blackbeard's ships anchored in Ocracoke Inlet, with many of Blackbeard's men ashore, including Israel Hands and his crew. As Maynard's 2 ships closed in, Blackbeard's Adventure opened fire, killing several soldiers, Marines actually, and forcing the Ranger to drop out of the fight. The Jane closed with the Adventure, crashing the 2 ships together, and the crews fought hand to hand. Maynard wounded Blackbeard twice with pistols, but Blackbeard was still attacking with his cutlass. Just as he was about to kill Maynard, a Marine attacked Blackbeard and slashed him across the back of the neck. The next arc of the sword decapitated him. Maynard's report shows that Blackbeard had been shot at least 5 times at close range and suffered at least 20 life-threatening deep sword cuts. With Blackbeard dead and being outnumbered, his surviving pirates surrendered. Depending upon the sources, about 10 pirates and 10 of the English Marines and sailors had been killed. But the accounts vary slightly. Maynard returned victorious to Virginia with Blackbeard's head displayed on the bowsprit of his sloop. Maynard found immediate fame as the man who vanquished Blackbeard, and the legend of the pirate continued. Whenever a pirate who had previously served with Blackbeard joined another ship, they were revered and respected. Then the legends started, such as Blackbeard's headless body swimming around Maynard's ship many times after being thrown overboard. Despite the great tales told about him after his death, the truth fell victim to sensationalism. His career as a pirate actually only lasted 2 years, but that was long enough to terrorize and threaten shipping commerce in the Caribbean and between the Americas and Europe. He had captured dozens of ships and had a fearsome reputation, but there is no evidence that he ever killed anyone until his final battle where he died. However, he was one of the last of his kind because by 1725, the so-called Golden Age of piracy was over, as all the major European navies and merchant fleets combined forces to combat them. The main source that created the various legends of Blackbeard was the biography of him written by Captain Charles Johnson, titled A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, published in May 1724 under the pen name Nathaniel Mist. Mist or Johnson, take your pick, a former sailor, printer, and journalist in London, based his tales on trial records, newspaper reports, and personal contact with retired pirates. Mist created the legend of a bloodthirsty demon raping and murdering his way into history. The book was a bestseller, requiring a second edition to be published within a few months, and another printing in 1725 and a fourth printing in 1726. The last edition was expanded, and many of Blackbeard's life and exploits were embellished and in fact fabricated and sensationalized, which is where most people gathered their history of the man. Also, Robert Louis Stevenson increased the sensationalizing of pirates when he wrote Kidnapped and Treasure Island, fictional books that captured the mind of people around the world. Ironically, what is overlooked is the fact that a pirate ship was the only true democracy in the world of monarchs and despots until the Age of Empires ended. Crews elected and even fired their captains, so it was the wise, disciplined, charismatic, and successful man who maintained his command. There was no segregation, no class distinctions, all were equal under the pirate code, as they all shared the danger and the glory, and no one ever walked the plank. The greatest surviving myth was Blackbeard's buried treasure, which has never been found and probably never existed. The Queen Anne's Revenge was discovered off the coast of North Carolina by divers in 1996, and hundreds of artifacts have been recovered in the years since. Such historical treasures include navigational devices such as sextants, cannons, pistols, dinnerware, and a sword hilt. Also recovered not long afterward was the ship's bell, cast and dated to 1705, a Swedish-made cannon dated to 1713. There is also good evidence that Blackbeard was also a slave trader, but also freed many slaves of the ships he captured to become a part of his crew, as had Black Caesar. Many of these relics are now on permanent display at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in nearby Beaufort, where I, your humble correspondent and narrator, currently live. If you come to visit, it is well worth a stop.
The early 1600s were an age of empires. Across Europe, nations fought brutal wars for power, trade, and territory. Spain and Portugal had dominated global trade for more than a century, building vast colonial networks that stretched across the Atlantic and into Asia. But a new challenger had emerged, the Dutch Republic. Fresh from its long war of independence against Spain, the Netherlands was rapidly transforming into one of the most powerful trading nations on Earth. And at the center of that rise was a single organization, the Dutch East India Company. Known by its Dutch initials, the VOC, it was more than just a corporation. It had its own army, navy, and the authority to wage war and establish colonies in the name of Dutch commerce. Its headquarters sat thousands of miles away from Europe in the bustling Asian port city of Batavia, what is today Jakarta, Indonesia. From there, Dutch merchants controlled the spice trade that flowed from the East Indies back to Europe. Cargoes of pepper, nutmeg, silk, and porcelain could make fortunes overnight. But getting those riches home was dangerous. The journey from the Netherlands to Batavia took months and crossed some of the most treacherous waters on Earth. Storms, reefs, disease, and pirates claimed ship after ship. Still, the rewards were so great that the voyages continued. In October of 1628, a newly built Dutch merchant ship left the port of Amsterdam on one of those journeys. Its name was the same as the capital, the Batavia. The ship carried hundreds of passengers and crew, along with one of the most valuable cargoes ever sent to the East Indies: silver coins meant to finance the Dutch trade empire. But hidden among the passengers was a man with a very different plan for the voyage. His name was Geronimus Cornelis, and before the Batavia ever left Europe, he was already planning a mutiny. But he had no idea the ship would soon crash into a reef off the coast of Australia, or that the survivors would find themselves trapped on a barren chain of islands, where over the next 3 months, more than 100 people would be murdered. So how could a group of ordinary sailors, soldiers, and civilians turn into one of the most brutal killing societies in maritime history? And when the rescue finally arrives months later, will there be anyone left alive to save? Let's try to find out.
Hello, I'm Mike Droberg, Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker, and we will try to answer these questions on today's episode of Forgotten History.
Beginning of the toughest 26 days in Marine Corps history.
With confidence in our armed forces.
The 36th President of the United States died this afternoon.
Tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off.
Command of Batavia rested with a seasoned officer of the Dutch East India Company, Francisco Pelsart. He was a merchant commander, a man trusted by the Dutch East India Company to move wealth across half the world. That responsibility carried enormous pressure. The cargo aboard of Batavia represented financial lifeblood of Dutch expansion in Asia. If the ship failed to reach the East Indies, fortunes would be lost. Batavia was one of the newest and most impressive merchant vessels, sailing under the banner of the Dutch East India Company. Nearly 200 feet long and heavily armed, she carried a mixture of passengers bound for the trading capital of Batavia on the island of Java. But among them was a man who had no interest in delivering the ship safely to its destination. His name was Geronimus Cornelis. Cornelis had once been a respected apothecary in the Dutch Republic, running a pharmacy in the city of Haarlem. For a time, he lived a comfortable life among the growing Dutch middle class, selling medicines and compounds to a busy port city during the height of the Dutch Golden Age. But that life collapsed in a series of devastating blows. Cornelis lived with a woman named Anna Jans, his partner, though the two were never formally married. Together, they had a young son, but the child died in infancy from congenital syphilis, a disease that in the early 17th century carried an enormous stigma and no reliable cure. The tragedy did not remain private. In a tightly religious society, such an illness brought suspicion and scandal with it. At the same time, Cornelis had begun associating with a controversial figure named Johannes van der Beek, better known by his nickname Terentius. Terentius was an artist and a mystic, whose teachings were considered dangerously heretical by both church and state. He preached a radical philosophy that rejected conventional morality, claiming that enlightened individuals were beyond the rules of sin and virtue. According to his critics, his followers embraced a lifestyle of open indulgence and debauchery, while dismissing the authority of the church. Authorities soon began investigating those connected to Terentius, and Cornelis found himself under suspicion. In the rigid social world of the Dutch Republic, that kind of accusation could destroy a man. His pharmacy business collapsed, his reputation was ruined, and he quickly became a social outcast. By the time Cornelis boarded Batavia, he was a man whose life in the Netherlands had effectively ended. Financially ruined, religiously suspect, and cut off from a respectable society, he was leaving Europe with little left to lose, but he was not leaving empty-handed. And as Batavia prepared to sail, Cornelis began quietly forming a plan that would transform him from a disgraced apothecary into something far more dangerous. The ship's cargo was worth a fortune. If a group of conspirators could seize the ship at sea, they could turn Batavia into a pirate vessel and then vanish into the vast waters of the Indian Ocean. Cornelis began quietly building support among the crew. Discontent was not hard to find. Long voyages under strict discipline often bred resentment, and the promise of wealth was a powerful motivator. Some sailors listened, while others joined the conspiracy, and as the Batavia prepared to leave the Netherlands, in October of 1628, the seeds of mutiny were already planted aboard the ship. With preparations complete, Batavia departed on its maiden voyage. Some were seeking fortunes in the East Indies. Others were simply trying to build new lives in distant colonies. VOC ships typically sailed south, along the coast of Africa, before turning east across the vast Indian Ocean. The route was faster, but extremely dangerous. Strong winds pushed ships across thousands of miles of open water, where navigational errors could send vessels dangerously close to the unknown western coast of Australia. For weeks, life aboard Batavia followed the rigid routines of a 17th century merchant voyage. The ship operated under strict hierarchy. At the top was the merchant commander, Francisco Pelsart, responsible for the cargo and the success of the mission. Beneath him was the ship's captain, Arian Jacobs, who commanded the vessel and its crew at sea. Relations between Jacobs and Pelsart had already begun to sour during the voyage. Disputes over authority and discipline created a growing rift between the two leaders of the ship. Cornelis saw opportunity in that tension. If the captain could be persuaded to turn against the commander, Batavia might fall into their hands without much resistance. The conspirators began laying the groundwork for mutiny. Some historians believe they even staged incidents aboard the ship to provoke conflict and to weaken Pelsart's authority. But before any rebellion could fully take shape, Batavia sailed into waters few Europeans understood. For weeks, the ship raced across the Indian Ocean, pushed by powerful winds along what Dutch navigators called the Brouwer route. The method saved time, but required precise navigation, and in the early hours of June 4th, 1629, something went terribly wrong. Most of the passengers were asleep below deck. The crew believed they were still safely in deep water. Then, in the darkness, something appeared ahead. But before anyone could react, the ship struck. The sound was violent and sudden. Wood splintered as Batavia slammed into the coral reef in the Houtman Aberloos. The impact threw sailors off their feet and sent passengers crashing from their bunks. The hull had been ripped open. Within moments, seawater began flooding into the lower decks. Below deck, terrified passengers woke to darkness and rising water. Some clawed their way up ladders toward the main deck. Others never made it out, trapped in the narrow corridors of the ship. Above them, chaos erupted. Men shouted orders that few could hear over the cracking timbers and crashing waves. Sailors scrambled to lower the ship's boats, but Batavia was pinned hard against the reef, grinding itself apart with every swell of the sea. Some people tried to climb onto riggings to escape the rising waters. Others jumped into the ocean. But the reef that had destroyed the ship waited just beneath the surface. Jagged coral tore through the water like blades. Waves slammed survivors against the rocks as they fought to stay afloat in the pitch-black sea. Some were dragged under by the current. Others disappeared without a sound. By the time the sun finally rose over the wreck of Batavia, nearly 40 people had died in the darkness. Stretching across the horizon was a scattered chain of low coral islands. Bleached rock surrounded by turquoise water. No trees, shade, or signs of fresh water. On these islands, dehydration could kill a person in 2 days. More than 300 people had survived the wreck, but the place they had washed ashore was a barren prison in the middle of the sea. And among the survivors walking those islands that morning was a man who had already been planning a mutiny, long before the ship ever struck the reef. Morning revealed the shattered remains of the Batavia sat stranded on the reef while hundreds of exhausted survivors struggled onto the nearby coral islands. The men responsible for the ship now faced an impossible situation. Francisco Pelsart, the merchant commander, was responsible for the cargo and the success of the mission. But the sailing ship itself had been under the authority of Captain Arian Jacobs. The relationship between the two men had already been strained during the voyage. Now, Batavia was destroyed, and hundreds of lives depended on what they did next. Search parties were sent across the nearby islands, but the results are grim. The coral outcrops offered little more than seabirds and scattered pools of salt water. Pelsart realized the survivors had only one real chance. Someone would have to sail north to the Dutch colonial capital of Batavia and bring help. It was a desperate gamble. The nearest Dutch settlement lay more than 2,500 kilometers away across the open Indian Ocean, but staying meant certain death. Within days of the wreck, Pelsart assembled a small group of officers and sailors and launched the ship's longboat. Captain Jacobs was among those who left with him. 48 men pushed out into the open sea in a small wooden boat, beginning one of the most remarkable survival voyages in maritime history. As the longboat disappeared into the horizon, nearly 300 survivors remained behind on the islands, and Geronimus Cornelius. At first, Cornelius appeared helpful. He walked among the survivors, organizing supplies and offering assistance. Many saw him as one of the few men willing to take charge during a growing crisis. But what survivors didn't realize was that Cornelius had just been handed exactly what he wanted. No commander or authority, and hundreds of frightened people, trapped on a handful of isolated islands. Within days, Cornelius began taking control. He moved confidently among the camps, assigning duties and gathering loyal followers around him. But his plans went far beyond simple survival. Cornelius knew that when the rescue ships eventually returned, his earlier conspiracy to seize Batavia would almost certainly be discovered. If witnesses survived long enough to speak, he would face execution. So he made a decision. Anyone who might testify against him had to disappear. Cornelius began gathering weapons from the wreck, arming a small group of loyal men. At the same time, he worked to neutralize the only people on the islands capable of resisting him, the soldiers. A group of Dutch soldiers had survived the wreck under the leadership of Viba Hayes. Cornelius claimed he had a simple mission from them. They would travel to a nearby island and search for fresh water. It sounded reasonable, but in reality, Cornelius expected them to die there. Without the soldiers, the remaining survivors would have no organized defense. Hayes and his men were sent away in small boats and left on a distant coral island with almost no supplies. With the soldiers gone, Cornelius tightened his control over the remaining survivors. Then, the killings began. At first they were quiet. A man sent to gather food who never returned. A woman who vanished during the night. A body discovered among the rocks. But the violence escalated quickly. Cornelius' followers began systematically murdering anyone they believed might resist them. Strong men were targeted first. Potential troublemakers were executed or abandoned on distant islands. Children were not spared. And women were taken as prisoners for a darker purpose. Cornelius and his followers claimed them as prizes, forcing them into sexual servitude while the killings continued around them. Over the following weeks, the survivors of Batavia realized the unthinkable truth. What had begun as a shipwreck was turning into something far worse, a reign of terror on a handful of empty islands. And no one knew how long it would last. Then there was a spark of hope. The men Cornelius had sent away to die did not die. Under the leadership of Viba Hayes, the stranded soldiers adapted quickly to the harsh islands. Hayes was a common soldier, but in the absence of leadership, he stepped into the role naturally. Hayes organized the men, rationed what little supplies they had, and began turning the island itself into a defensive position. They scavenged coral rock and built a low defensive wall along the shoreline where boats might attempt to land. The structure was crude but effective. Narrow approaches forced attackers to funnel into predictable paths where the soldiers could hold their ground. They also armed themselves with whatever they could find. Spears made from salvaged wood, stones, improvised clubs, anything that could be used as a weapon. Before long, refugees began arriving on their island. Survivors who had escaped the killings carried horrifying stories of what was happening under the rule of Geronimus Cornelius. The soldiers now understood the truth. Rescue was not coming, and they had to prepare for war. Eventually, Cornelius decided to deal with the problem himself. Confident that the starving soldiers would surrender easily, he sailed to Hayes' Island with a small group of followers. But Hayes had anticipated exactly that move. As Cornelius came ashore, the soldiers sprang their trap. They rushed the mutiny leader before his men could react, overpowering him in a brief struggle and taking him prisoner. His followers were forced back to their boats as the soldiers dragged their captive behind the coral defenses. The man who had ruled the islands through terror was suddenly powerless. Hayes and the soldiers bound Cornelius and held him captive, knowing that when the rescue ships finally returned, he would face justice for the massacre. But the fighting was not over. Cornelius's followers were still alive. The mutineers were now leaderless, scattered across the islands. Still, they were dangerous. Cornelius had left behind loyal men who had already committed murder. If they surrendered, they knew what awaited them when the rescue finally arrived: execution. So instead of giving up, they chose to fight. The mutineers began organizing attacks against the soldiers led by Hayes, hoping to free their captured leader before any rescue ship returned. Several times, they launched assaults against Hayes' Island, but each time, the soldiers held their ground. Hayes used narrow beaches and coral rocks to his advantage. The mutineers could only land in small numbers, forcing them to fight uphill against men who were already waiting behind stone defenses. The attacks failed. Again and again, the mutineers were driven back into their boats. As weeks passed, the situation grew more desperate for everyone still alive on the islands. Food was scarce. Water was precious. Both sides knew that time was running out. Then, sometime in September of 1629, something appeared on the horizon. A ship. It was the Dutch vessel Sardom, commanded by Francisco Pelsart. He had made the remarkable voyage across the Indian Ocean and returned. But when the Sardom approached the islands, something strange happened. A small boat suddenly launched from Hayes' Island and raced towards the rescue ship. The men aboard shouting a warning. The commander needed to hear the truth before anyone else could reach them. Pelsart immediately realized the danger. Armed sailors from the Sardom quickly secured the islands. The remaining mutineers were hunted down and arrested. Then, Pelsart began the grim work of uncovering what had happened during the 3 months he had been gone. Survivors described nights filled with terror. Men executed along the rocks. Women sexually exploited under the control of the mutineers. Mass graves were discovered across the islands. Pelsart wasted little time delivering justice. A field court was assembled on the islands. Witnesses were questioned, confessions were taken, and Cornelius was interrogated for several days. During the questioning, Cornelius didn't deny the killings. He admitted to organizing them, but attempted to blame shift to his followers and to the chaos of the situation. Cornelius himself reportedly remained cold and composed, even when confronted with witness testimony describing the murders. Once the investigation was complete, Pelsart convened a field court and issued sentences. Cornelius was condemned as the principal architect of the massacre. The punishment for Cornelius was severe. Before his execution, both of his hands were sawed off. Then, he was hanged from a makeshift gallows built from the wreckage on the island, where so many of his victims had died. Several of his closest followers were executed alongside him. Others were taken aboard the Sardom to face trial at Batavia. But for 2 of the mutineers, Pelsart chose a different fate. Instead of execution, they were marooned on the nearby mainland of Australia. No weapons or supplies, just a barren coastline stretching into the unknown. No one knows what became of them. After restoring order, Commander Pelsart organized salvage operations at the wreck site. Divers and sailors worked in the shallow water around the reef, prying open the remains of the ship and hauling heavy chests up from the seabed. Despite the destruction of the vessel, most of the treasure had survived. 10 of the 12 chests of silver coins were successfully recovered. The cargo that had been tempted by mutineers to seize the ship was lifted from the wreck and loaded aboard the rescue vessel, continuing its journey to the Dutch trading capital of Batavia. In the end, the wealth that had inspired the conspiracy was never lost. But the human cost was staggering. Of more than 300 people who survived the wreck of the Batavia, more than 100 had been murdered, including women and children, during the 3 months that followed. What began as a maritime disaster had turned into something far darker. A society collapsing under fear, power seized by a single man, and ordinary people forced to choose between survival and brutality. Today, the Coral Islands, where the massacre took place, remain quiet and empty. The stones of the small defensive walls built by Viva Hayes still stand among the rocks, silent reminders of the desperate struggle that once unfolded there. A shipwreck brought hundreds of survivors to those islands, but it also revealed how quickly civilization can disappear when authority vanishes and fear takes hold. The Batavia disaster was not just a tragedy of the sea. It was a warning about what people are capable of when the rules of society are stripped away. And for 3 months, on a handful of coral islands off the coast of Australia, more than 3 centuries before William Golding wrote The Lord of the Flies, Batavia survivors had already lived it. Let us know your thoughts on the Batavia Massacre in the comments below.
When the storm clouds of war gathered, the American colonies were in no position to fight the greatest land and naval power in the world, the British Empire. The colonials had no navy, no standing army, just a collection of colonial militias that were not a traditional standardized force, and of course we had no Marine Corps. Foreign assistance to aid the colonies in their desire to be free came in many forms, such as foreign military officers like the Prussian Baron von Steuben, the French Marquis de Lafayette, and Polish Casimir Pulaski, and a Scottish fugitive from British justice, John Paul Jones. These foreigners helped create and train the American forces in the great struggle to come, but one would stand out. Who was John Paul Jones? Why was he critical to the colonial forces? What did he actually do to create what would become the United States Navy? What happened to him after the American Revolution?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
John Paul Jones was born John Paul on July 6, 1747 in Kirkcudbright, Scotland, under the name of John Paul, the Jones being added later. And coming from a very modest family with few prospects, he signed on into the British Merchant Marine and went to sea for the first time as a cabin boy at age 12. He spent many years at sea and learned all the skills required of an able seaman, and also became a master navigator, after which he became first mate on a brigantine slave ship collecting their human cargo off the coast of West Africa. Being personally appalled by the slave trade, he transferred to a merchantman in 1766 and was appointed a ship's master in 1769. His problems began when in 1773 he faced a mutiny aboard ship while anchored in Tobago. Depending upon the source and story, the leader of the mutiny attacked him with a bludgeon, and he killed the man in self-defense with either a pistol or sword. The British Admiralty took an interest and wanted a formal trial. The dead man apparently had powerful business friends in London. It was apparent that John Paul would probably not receive a fair trial, as the crew who mutinied would be called to testify. Others on the ship who supported his case as witnesses were removed from the ship and scattered to other ships so as to be unavailable as defense witnesses. John Paul saw what was coming, and that he would not receive a fair trial, so he fled to Virginia and was listed as a fugitive from justice by the British government, which was why he added the surname Jones. Jones had landed in the colonies at just the right time, as they were in the early stages of breaking away from Great Britain. As a wanted man, he fit right in with the rebellious colonial leadership, who were also considered criminals and traitors. In 1775, Jones arrived in Philadelphia and signed on to the Continental Navy, which was just in its birthing stage, and received his commission as a lieutenant on the first American flagship, the sloop Alfred. Jones was also very knowledgeable of the Royal Navy's tactics and methods. He met with the colonial leadership and laid out his vision as to what the Continental Navy needed to have a chance at winning the coming war. He told them that due to the time required and the great expense and resources required, they would need to build a frigate fleet. His argument was that the Americans would never be able to build the ships of the line, the battleships of their day, with between 74 and 100 guns or more. They could build 4 fast, well-armed frigates instead for the same cost as one ship of the line and in far shorter time. He also suggested that the Americans adopt a seagoing fighting force, such as the British had with their Royal Marines, who maintained a discipline and order on their warships and also operated as an amphibious landing force. An American officer, Samuel Nichols, was also of the same mindset, and following the meeting with Jones, the Continental Congress commissioned Nichols to raise 2 battalions of seafaring warriors, in essence, creating a corps of Marines. In a place called Tun Tavern in Philadelphia on November 10, 1775, Samuel Nichols appointed Robert Mullen, who owned Tun Tavern, as the first U.S. Marine recruiter, while Nichols interviewed the prospects and vetted their qualifications. Jones's argument was taken seriously. He had his Marines and was instrumental in the building of the heavily armed frigates. Along with his experience and powers of persuasion, Jones was quickly promoted to captain in 1776 and given command of the lightly gunned but very fast sloop USS Providence. His bravery and willingness to take great risks were duly noted, and his advice was often sought. By the end of October, Congress authorized the purchase of outfitting 4 armed vessels. On December 3, the USS Alfred, USS Andrew, USS Doria, USS Cabot, and USS Columbus, and later the USS Providence, USS Wasp, and USS Alliance joined the small fleet. Some of these ships were refitted merchantmen. On December 22, 1775, Admiral Essex Hopkins was appointed the naval commander-in-chief, and officers of the Navy were commissioned. John Paul Jones was one of the first commissioned fleet officers serving under him. In March 1776, this small fleet, complemented by the Providence and Wasp, Hopkins led the first major naval action of the Continental Navy against Nassau, Bahamas, where stores of much-needed gunpowder were seized for the use of the Continental Army and Navy. On April 6, 1776, the squadron, including USS Fly, unsuccessfully encountered the 20-gun HMS Glasgow in the first major sea battle of the Continental Navy, where Marine sharpshooters were stationed in the fighting tops of the ship's masts and targeting enemy officers, naval gunners, and helmsmen. Jones's plan was for the Marines to conduct 2 amphibious landings in Nassau, in the Bahamas, to seize naval stores from the British, with the first landing led by Captain Nichols, with 250 Marines and sailors who landed in New Providence, in the Bahamas, destroying installations and capturing gunpowder and food supplies. The second landing, led by Lieutenant Trevette, landed at night and captured several ships at anchor along with the supplies. Congress then authorized the addition of 13 frigates to be specifically constructed as warships rather than refitting merchantmen. While on his first cruise aboard USS Providence, Jones's seamanship saw his crew destroy British fisheries in Nova Scotia and capture 16 ships as prizes, which were later reflagged as American vessels and put to good use. On November 2, 1777, Jones was in command of the newly built USS Ranger with a crew of 140 men. They departed from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, headed to the naval port at Brest, France. Bringing the USS Ranger into port in France, the American ship was saluted by the French Admiral La Motte Piquet, making USS Ranger the first American vessel ever to be recognized by a foreign power. After reprovisioning with food and water, they sailed into the Irish Sea and began raiding on British targets. Targeting merchantmen and fishing vessels, he hoped to damage their economy. During 1777 and 1778, Ranger operated in British home waters, and Jones, with his Marines, led daring raids on English and Scottish shore installations, destroying buildings and capturing powder and shot. The Continental Congress was impressed with his audacity and success, and in recognition of these successes, he was placed at overall command of 5 French and American vessels. The French had refitted an East India merchant ship launched in 1766, the Duc de Duras, into a new frigate, the Bonhomme Richard, or Goodman Richard, named after Benjamin Franklin's pamphlet character in his Poor Richard's Almanac, and Jones always carried a copy with him. Jones led his small squadron on his new flagship, Bonhomme Richard, formerly named, and they succeeded into the capture of 7 merchantmen off the Scottish coast. On September 23, 1779, Jones and his ship fought one of the bloodiest engagements in U.S. naval history with the 44-gun Navy frigate Serapis. The HMS Serapis was a Royal Navy 2-decked Roebuck-class fifth-rate, or frigate, commanded by Captain Richard Pearson. She was a new ship launched in early 1779 and, at that time, was armed with 50 guns. The Bonhomme Richard, with 380 officers and enlisted sailors and Marines, mounted 42 guns, and being an older ship, was vulnerable to below-the-waterline cannonball penetration. Jones's aggressive action almost ended in disaster, and after exchanging broadsides, with his own vessel burning and sinking, Captain Pearson of Serapis, seeing the sinking American ship, requested that Jones surrender, but Jones did not accept the British demand, replying, "I have not yet begun to fight." Jones then crashed his ship into the Serapis, and his crew tied the 2 ships together as his Marines threw themselves onto the larger British ship's deck. 3 hours later, after severe hand-to-hand combat with the American Marines sweeping the deck with musket fire and leading a boarding party, the Serapis surrendered, and Jones took control and transferred his flag. When the Bonhomme Richard sank, Jones took command of Serapis. This engagement made headlines on both continents, and it was one of the factors following the American victory at Saratoga 2 years earlier that convinced France to get heavily involved with assisting the colonies against their mutual enemy. He was praised by the Americans and the French, while the British, learning who he was, wrote about him as a pirate, a bloody butcher, and a common criminal, and they compared him to Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, and put a price on his head. The writings about him from his contemporaries, such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, described him as well-dressed, carried a sword, and conducted himself with practiced decorum. He had a Scottish brogue and a light Celtic feature. He was intense about his honor and his duties, and was a harsh military master, but was also surprisingly sociable. Thomas Jefferson was an admirer and thought good of him after their meeting, and others referred to him as Little Jones, as he stood 5 feet 5 inches tall, and he was a prolific poem and letter writer, spoke some French, and, though he never married, was involved in many romances. Jones found that after the United States won its independence, there was a lot of political infighting, and there was probably a lot of personal jealousy against him, so he moved on to other efforts. In 1788, Russian Empress Catherine the Great wanted to increase Russia's naval capabilities and appointed Jones as a rear admiral. in which he saw action in the Liman campaign in the Black Sea against the Turks. Following his duty for Russia in 1789, he moved to Paris and was appointed as the U.S. consul to Algiers, but he died before the commission arrived. His body was buried in Paris. In 1905, after a lengthy search, his grave was discovered and removed from the gravesite in Paris and brought to the United States due to the efforts of President Theodore Roosevelt. John Paul Jones's remains were reinterred in an ornate tomb at the Naval Academy Chapel at Annapolis, Maryland in 1913. In his honor, commissioned in 1991, the USS John Paul Jones DDG-53 is the latest destroyer named in honor of Jones. 3 previous ships were also named after him. Other ships named after John Paul Jones were the Paul Jones, a side-wheel steam gunboat, the Paul Jones DD-10, the Paul Jones DD-230, the John Paul Jones DD-932, and John Paul Jones DDG-53. John Paul Jones is regarded as the father of the United States Navy and was a catalyst for the creation of the United States Marine Corps. He helped us secure our freedom from Great Britain, and his legend is secure.
Whether through the old legend itself, or maybe through the immensely popular movie series, The Pirates of the Caribbean, you've probably heard of Davy Jones and his ship, the Flying Dutchman, and also his famous locker. However, his story in The Pirates of the Caribbean is nothing like the real story, except for the fact that Davy Jones is the captain of the famous Flying Dutchman. Mariners used to tell terrifying stories to each other about this legendary pirate, but who was he exactly? And where does the legend come from? And what is Davy Jones's locker? Let's try and find out. Hello, I'm Mike Joberg, Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker, and we will try to answer these questions on today's episode of Forgotten History. It is unclear when the Davy Jones stories exactly took place, but it was probably around the 1500s when people started traveling at sea much more frequently. Among the different stories, some depict him as a pirate, the devil, and an evil god of the seas. One theory is that Davy Jones was the owner of a British pub. He would get sailors drunk and lock them in his ale locker. Then he would sell their unconscious bodies as crews to ships in need of sailors that were passing through the harbor. The story also goes on to say that Davy Jones's pub eventually went bankrupt, which made him decide to become a pirate. He stole a ship from the harbor and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, hijacking other ships and ruthlessly decapitating or keel-hauling most of the crew who did not surrender. Keel-hauling was a cruel form of punishment and execution. Historians believe that keel-hauling may have been introduced by the Dutch Navy by William of Orange. On October 11th, 1652, under Jan van Riebeck's command, Jan Blank, a sailor, was keel-hauled, whipped a total of 150 lashes, and then enslaved for 2 years as punishment for deserting. Keel-hauling is performed by plunging the delinquent repeatedly under the ship's bottom on one side and hoisting him up the other, having passed under the keel of the ship. The blocks or pulleys by which he is suspended are fastened to the opposite extremities of the main yard, and a weight of lead or iron is hung among his legs to sink him to a competent depth. By this apparatus he is drawn close to the yard arm and also let to suddenly fall into the sea, where, passing under the ship's bottom, he is hoisted up the opposite side of the vessel. Most sailors will not survive the punishment and drown. Finally, if not decapitated or keel-hauled, the surviving crew will be locked in the ship, and the ship will be damaged so that it could be sunk. There are also actual records of a pirate by the name of Davy Jones, who sailed the seas across the Indian Ocean around the 1630s, but this pirate captain wasn't that well known, and most historians do not think he could have gathered such worldwide fame. In other stories, Davy Jones is the captain of the Flying Dutchman, a legendary ghost ship, allegedly never able to make port, and doomed to sail the seas forever. The myths and ghost stories are likely to have originated from the 17th century golden age of the Dutch East India Company. According to legend, if hailed by another ship, the crew of the Flying Dutchman might try to send messages to land or to people that are long dead. Reported sightings in the 19th and 20th centuries claimed that the ship glowed with a ghostly light. In ocean lore, the sight of this phantom ship functions as a portent of doom. It was commonly believed that the Flying Dutchman was a 17th century cargo vessel known as a flute. Originating in the Dutch Republic in the 16th century, the vessel was designed to facilitate transoceanic delivery with a maximum of space and crew efficiency. Unlike rivals, it was not built for conversion in wartime to a warship, so it was cheaper to build and carry twice the cargo and could be handled by a smaller crew. It is a common superstition of mariners that in the high southern latitudes on the coast of Africa, hurricanes are frequently ushered in by the appearance of the Flying Dutchman. Another theory is that the crew of this vessel are supposed to have been guilty of some dreadful crime and said to have been stricken with pestilence and are ordained to traverse the ocean, on which they perished till the period of their penance is expired. Sir Walter Scott was the first to refer to the vessel as a pirate ship, writing in the notes to Rockby, a poem first published in December of 1812, that the ship was originally a vessel loaded with great wealth, on board of which some horrid acts of murder and piracy had been committed, and that the apparition of the ship is considered by mariners as the worst of all possible omens. There have also been many reported or alleged sightings in the 19th and 20th centuries. One of the most well-known sightings was recorded by Prince George of Wales, the future King George V. He was on a 3-year voyage during his late adolescence in 1880 with his elder brother, Prince Albert Victor of Wales, aboard the HMS Inconstant. The Prince's log records the following at the pre-dawn hours of 11 July 1881 off the coast of Australia. At 4 a.m., the Flying Dutchman crossed our bows. A strange red light, as of a phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which it lights the masts, spars, and sails of a brig 200 yards distant stood out in strong relief as she came up the port bow, where also the officer of the watch from the bridge clearly saw her, as did the quarterdeck shipman, who was sent forward at once to the forecastle. But on arriving there was no vestige nor any sign of whatever of any material ship was to be seen, either near or right away to the horizon, the night being clear and the sea calm. 13 persons altogether saw her. Then, at 10:45 a.m., an ordinary seaman, who had this morning reported the Flying Dutchman, fell from the fore topmast cross trees onto the topgallant forecastle and was smashed to atoms. Moving on to the earliest written mentionings of Davy Jones's locker comes from the book 4 Years' Voyage of Captain George Roberts by Daniel Defoe in 1726 and The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle by Tobias Smollett in 1751. Both of those books describe Davy Jones as a deity of death and the final resting place of dead sailors. During the years when the legend of Davy Jones was at its highest, many sailors refused to discuss anything related to it in great detail. However, there's a long-standing tradition of celebrating the crossing of the equatorial line that includes paying homage to Davy Jones. Popularization of Davy Jones's locker happened during the 19th century. His important mentionings happened in the works of Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, Charles Dickens, and most famously in Robert Louis Stevenson's 1883 novel, Treasure Island. Continuing into the 20th century, Davy Jones was mentioned in many books and songs, but his most notable appearance happened in Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean movie franchise, where he was featured as the undying evil spirit that collects the souls of dying pirates while traveling in his legendary ship, the Flying Dutchman. and his locker was portrayed as a sort of purgatory for the dead souls. Davy Jones' locker is a sailor's synonym for the ocean floor. A locker was another name for a chest back in the day, so being sent to Davy Jones' locker actually means dying at sea. In some stories, evil and wicked sailors who died at sea were locked up in the chest by Davy Jones and had to spend an eternity trapped there. In the Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, Davy Jones was the main villain. He was supposed to bring the souls from sunken ships to work aboard the Flying Dutchman. Instead of going into the afterlife, Jones proposes that the dead men come to work on his ship for 100 years and convinces them that the afterlife is even worse. He also commands the mythical beast, the Kraken. In conclusion, Davy Jones remains a legendary figure whose lore has transcended the boundaries of history and myth. Whether as a feared pirate captain of maritime folklore or a supernatural character in popular culture, his legacy endures as a symbol of the treacherous and mysterious nature of the sea. The tales of Davy Jones continues to captivate our imagination, reminding us of the eternal allure and perils of the ocean's depths. Let us know your thoughts on Davy Jones.
Piracy is as old as the sea itself. Since men first pushed out in ships, there were those who took up the trade of high seas crime. But piracy and slavery went hand in hand. Between the 1500s and 1800s, over 1 million European men, women, and children were kidnapped, chained, and sold in open-air slave markets across North Africa. These slaves came from France, Spain, Italy, England, Ireland, and even Iceland and Norway, as well as Denmark. Their captors were Muslim pirates. The Barbary corsairs built cities and expanded empires based upon the white slave trade, becoming even more effective by the 17th century. But how? Their capabilities were increased by the training and leadership of a most unusual man, an Englishman who made them almost unstoppable. He became a mercenary who changed not only his methods, but also his religion, and greatly advanced the capabilities of the Barbary pirates, who would be the scourge of 2 continents for the next 200 years. Who was John Ward? Why did he become a pirate? How successful was he? What was his fate?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
John Ward was also known as Jack Ward, or Birdie, as he was sometimes called. The real Jack Sparrow is based on the 17th century English pirate John Ward. Ward was born around 1553 in Faversham, Kent, a coastal market town in southeast England. He started his maritime career as a fisherman while still a boy, but later became a privateer in 1588 following the Spanish Armada under Queen Elizabeth I, fighting against the Spanish alongside men like Sir John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake, who were called Queen Elizabeth I's Sea Dogs. These privateers seriously damaged Spanish commerce around the world, taking or sinking treasure ships and slaves. In order to be legitimate, the Sea Dogs had to be commissioned with the Crown's letter of marque. This symbolized their authority to plunder enemy ships without being branded as pirates, and a percentage of the proceeds from their activities was submitted to the Crown. But when James I made peace with Spain in 1604, many men returned to shore to find work. At this time, Ward was allegedly pressed into service, basically kidnapped, for service on a ship sailing under the authority of the king, where he served aboard a ship named the Lion's Whelp, operating with the Channel Fleet. Ward, a former privateer, now a conscripted slave, must have felt betrayed. Shortly afterward, Ward and about 30 men had mutinied aboard the Lion's Whelp near Plymouth and stole the 25-ton vessel and sailed to the Isle of Wight, and Ward was elected captain. Englishmen who took to piracy had little to fear from their own country as long as they did not attack English ships or any ships who were from allied nations. Raiding the Spanish, French, or even the Dutch was of no great concern to the Crown. This was among the earliest reports of a pirate leader being chosen through elections, an example of pure democracy in an age of monarchs and tyrants. But Ward's mutiny and taking the ship changed things, and that was a death sentence if he were to be caught. Ward and his crew captured and plundered a few small ships along the way. It is said that Ward officially decided to become a pirate at a tavern. According to a pamphlet written by Andrew Barker, an alleged captive of Ward, the pirate was so disgruntled with the world that he described it as scurvy. The pamphlet quoted Ward as saying, "My mates," quoth he, "what's to be done? Here's a scurvy world, and as scurvily we live in it. We feed here upon the water, on the king's salt beef, without e'er a pence to buy as a bissel," meaning a bushel, "of grain when we come ashore. Revel, sup, and be merry, every one at the proper charge of his own purse. This night, when the captain and officers shall conjecture nothing but that we are drawing dry the pot, we'll be diving arm deep in the fugitives' bags." They sailed to the Isle of Wight and captured another ship, the Violet, which was rumored to be carrying the treasure of Roman Catholic refugees. Although the ship turned out to have no treasure, Ward added it to his growing fleet and used her to capture a much larger French ship. But Ward and his crew were in trouble, so in order to avoid the English Navy, who would be after them for the mutiny and theft of a ship, then began raiding vessels in the Mediterranean Sea from southern France, Spain to Sardinia, Sicily, and the coast of Italy, and reached Algiers, then Morocco. In 1605, Ward had sailed to Tunis, which was under Ottoman control, and offered his services to the Bey of Tunis. This would be a great benefit to Ward because he had an arrangement with a troop commander from Tunis named Uthman Dey. Dey would give his ship sanctuary, and he also had the privilege of going through the stolen merchandise as payment. Ward's small fleet operated far and wide once they were low on supplies, especially food and water that they needed, and water being a major source, they would pull into ports. But because unsuccessful captains could also be voted out of office, he had to plunder. Ward was something of an enigmatic Robin Hood type of figure, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, many English pirates operated out of the mouth of the Cebu River and preyed upon Mediterranean shipping. Possibly hoping for a pardon from King James I, Ward was supposed to have spared English ships while attacking Papist vessels, meaning Catholic Church vessels. John Ward and Simon Danziger are both credited with introducing the Barbary pirates to the use of square-rigged ships of northern Europe. Ward was denied a pardon, so he intensified his maritime operations. All ships were now fair game. Ward headed to Algiers, but several of his men were arrested upon entering the city because the city had been attacked by another English mariner, Richard Giffard, several months earlier. Ward then left and sailed to Salé, Morocco, on the Atlantic coast, where, in 1605, several English and Dutch sailors, including Richard Bishop and Anthony Johnson, joined Ward's crew. Ward captured a dhow in the Strait of Gibraltar, and in the summer of 1606, which was supposedly carrying Catholic slaves, and in August, Ward arranged to use Tunis as a base of operations in an agreement with the Uthman Dey. Uthman Dey, or Kara Osman Bey, as he was also known, was the commander and military governor of the Janissary Corps in Tunis. According to their arrangement, Uthman Bey would have first right of refusal of all goods, up to 10% of all goods captured, which gave him a sanctuary port. In early November 1606, Ward captured the English merchantman John Baptist, commanded by Captain John Key. Ward renamed it Little John, after the English folk hero, adding one more to his fleet, enabling him to easily and ably capture many ships from several European nations. Ward's other commanders were also successful, and his top lieutenant, William Graves, captured a small English merchantman called the York Bonaventure, captained by Andrew Barker. That was one of the richest hauls, equaling his capture of the valuable Venetian ships Ruby, captured on November 16, 1606, and Carminati, captured on January 28, 1607. By this time, Ward had at least 4 vessels, the 400-ton Dutch 32-gunboat Gift that he had captured and renamed, and he still had Little John, Ruby, and Carminati, with all the merchantmen fitted with cannons. Ward had asked James I of England again for a royal pardon, which was refused, due to a threat of war from Venice, as Ward had attacked many Venetian ships, and he reluctantly returned to Tunis. Uthman Bey, an Ottoman officer of Tunis, kept his word and granted him protection. Ward accepted his other offer. He accepted Islam along with his entire crew and changed his name to Yusuf Rais, with a nickname of Chakur or Chagur because he used an axe in his privacy acts. Ward, to avoid paying levies and fitting into his new environment and conversion taking the name of Yusuf, he quickly became one of the most successful corsairs in the Mediterranean. His new faith and allegiance infuriated the English, who labeled him a traitor and apostate. But all attempts to capture or extradite him failed. But what really angered his fellow countrymen were the reports that Ward had trained his new Barbary pirate comrades in the art and skill of English naval gunnery and seamanship, converting the rigging of their corsairs to better maneuver even in the highest and lightest winds and tack without compromising their offensive position. Operating from Tunis, Ward launched raids on Venetian, Spanish, and Christian merchant ships, becoming wildly wealthy and infamous. His most notorious score came on April 26, 1607, when he captured the massive Reniera de Soterina, a Venetian galleon which weighed between 1,400 to 1,500 tons, loaded with gold, silk, and valuable goods, while sailing between Cyprus and Turkey. Although the Italian ship was armed and much bigger, Ward and his mates were skilled at naval gunnery and very experienced in boarding ships, so they remained unfazed. They suspected that it was a heavily laden commerce ship, and they were right. The ships fought for 3 hours, but Reniera de Soterina, being too large to maneuver in the light winds, could not score effective hits. Ward's ships managed to outmaneuver her and penetrate her upper bulwark 5 times, setting bales of hay inside on fire. Finally, Ward then ordered his ships to close and board. The crew of Reniera de Soterina decided to fight the boarding party and were given small arms. However, a well-timed volley of chain shot from Ruby hit at least 2 defenders, tearing them apart. The carpenter aboard Reniera de Soterina confronted his captain, telling him to surrender or face a mutiny. The captain consented, and Ward captured the ship with no further fighting. According to Andrew Barker, her cargo was esteemed to be worth 2 millions in the least, meaning £2 million. Being understandably upset, the Venetian ambassador in London told the Privy Council that Venice was close to declaring war on England due to Ward's piracy. That ambassador, Secretary Esposizioni, had declared the cargo's value at £2 million, and he wrote, "That famous pirate Ward, so well known in this part for the damage he has done, is beyond a doubt the greatest scoundrel that ever sailed from England. He has refitted a Venetian ship, Soterina, and turned her into a Berton, with 40 pieces of bronze artillery on the lower and 20 on the upper deck. He has given his old ship to Captain Graves, and these 2 and some other 4 ships form 6 fighting ships in all." The English government disagreed with the amount and the estimated value of the cargo to be worth only £500,000. Still, a report from the English ambassador in Venice assured the council, "As to Ward, who captured the Soterina and transformed her into a Berton, will meet with a warm reception if he comes into these waters." John Ward had totally re-outfitted and armed Gift, Little John Ruby, and Carminati by the early spring of 1607. In June 1607, he outfitted Reniera de Soterina into a powerful man-of-war. The crew cut at least 20 new gun ports into her hull to accommodate 60 additional brass guns, as related by the Venetian ambassador. Ward's training of the Barbary pirates saw them raid the Faroe Islands, kidnapping and enslaving dozens of people in 1607. But they wanted greater numbers of slaves. Ward then expanded their fleet with new hull designs and rigging to allow for such excursions. He set out to sail in early 1608. Then, in March, a ship spotted wreckage of a ship off the coast of Greece, and rumors began to spread that it was Reniera de Soterina and John Ward was dead. Ward, aboard the Gift, took his fleet into the Adriatic Sea, where they were scattered by a terrible storm. Ward, aboard the Gift, later found only the 200-ton Ruby, assuming the others were sunk before heading for the eastern Mediterranean. The port city of Aquileia, now El Hurray, was his interim port. and he even married an Italian woman who may have been a former slave while continuing to send money to his English wife. Around 1612, he retired from piracy and ran a school to teach young burgeoning Barbary pirates gunnery and navigation. For centuries, the Barbary corsairs used one or more triangular sails, which allowed for fast movement in a steady tailwind, but were not that effective in tacking. Ward showed them how to properly rig their ships to adjust to any wind direction, incorporating the jib, topsail, and gallant. He also trained them in effective gunnery, to include bouncing cannonballs off the water like skipping a stone, which ensured a shot did not go high over the target and guaranteed impact. Ward also educated them in celestial navigation decades before the sextant was developed. He also showed them how to make navigational charts and measuring the depths beneath the hulls in shallow water. This allowed for close-to-shore sailing and reduced the chance of running aground while deploying raiding parties. These skills aided the Muslim pirates to operate in open water without having to remain close to the shoreline for navigation and risk being observed. Ward's total accumulated wealth is unknown, but he must have done quite well. Unlike most pirates, he settled down and bought a grand palace in Tunis, married a local woman, and lived like royalty. Ward still maintained his private navy, shared his plunder with the Bey, and lived out his days peacefully in Tunis in 1622 at the age of 70, possibly dying from the plague as there had been an outbreak, but his legacy lived on. His Barbary pirates placed these methods into practice, and after Ward's death, their raids into Western and Northern Europe exploded. This was where they performed most of the raids to kidnap slaves. In August 1625, corsairs raided Mounts Bay, Cornwall, England, capturing 60 men, women, and children and taking them into slavery. In 1626, St. Keverne was repeatedly attacked, and boats out of Loy, Penzance, Mousehole, and other Cornish ports were boarded, their crews taken captive, and the enemy ships left to drift. It was feared that there were around 60 Barbary men of war prowling the Devon and Cornish coasts, and attacks were now occurring almost daily. Their first raids to Iceland occurred in the summer of 1627 using Ward's tactics. This first raid killed dozens of people, and they kidnapped more than 400, mostly women, to sell as slaves in Salé and Algiers. The sheer audacity of the 6,000-mile round trip makes it exceptional and shows the impact Ward had. On June 20th, 1631, the village of Baltimore in West Cork, Ireland, was attacked by pirates from the Barbary coast of North Africa, and they were led by Dutch captain from Haarlem, Murad Rees the Younger, who had been a slave of the Barbary pirates and was freed following his conversion to Islam. In 1633, the Irish village of Dunargan was also attacked by a slave raid, resulting in an estimated 50 captives. But the total numbers of persons kidnapped is unknown. While the actual numbers of all of these raids combined in Ireland is debatable, it is believed that at least 107 to up to 237 people were taken in these two raids alone to the slave markets in Algiers. Some prisoners spent the rest of their lives as galley slaves without ever setting foot on shore, while others would spend long years in a harem as sex slaves and concubines or as slave laborers. Only 3 at most of the slaves taken on these raids ever returned to Ireland. One person was ransomed almost at once, and 2 others in 1646. Most were never heard from again. The panic that hit Parliament in December 1640 created the Committee for Algiers to oversee the ransoming of captives. At that time, due to repeated successful raids, it was reported that there were some 3,000 to 5,000 English people in captivity in Algiers. Charities were also established in the coastal villages and fishing communities to help raise ransom money to free the captives. In some cases, entire families had disappeared. In 1645, another raid by Barbary pirates on the Cornish coast kidnapped 240 men, women, and children. The following year, Parliament sent Edmund Casson to Algiers to negotiate the ransom and release of English captives. He paid, on average, £30 per man. Women were more expensive to ransom, and managed to free some 250 people before he ran out of money. Casson spent the last 8 years of his life trying to arrange the release of a further 400 Englishmen. By the 1650s, the attacks were so frequent that they threatened England's fishing industry, and fishermen were reluctant to put to sea, leaving their families unprotected ashore. Then it was decided to take the fight to the Muslims, and several nations set aside their differences to do so. In 1675, Sir John Narborough, backed by a Royal Navy squadron, managed to negotiate a peace with Tunis after a heavy naval bombardment, and a similar agreement was reached with Tripoli. But it would not last. Due to the great reach of the pirates, Algiers was attacked from the sea by British, French, and Spanish ships on several occasions, which brought a temporary pause in the kidnappings. But it was the United States of America who fought 2 wars against the Barbary states of North Africa to finally disrupt that slave trade. Even Denmark and Norway fell victim, such as the Faroe Islands, which belonged to Denmark at the time and suffered repeated slave raids by the Muslims in the 16th through 18th centuries. The most famous slave raid on the Faroe Islands was the slave raid of Suroy in the summer of 1629, in which 30 people were abducted into slavery, from which they never returned. The Danish-Algerian War from 1769 to 1722 between Denmark, Norway, and the Dalek of Algiers took place partially because of the Barbary piracy against Danish and Norwegian ships, whose crews were then sold into slavery. However, France remained pretty much immune from these attacks due to the Franco-Ottoman alliance, which lasted from 1536 to 1798. The Ottoman sultans, and by extension the North African Muslims, did not raid the French coast or attack French ships on a regular basis, but mistakes were made. The death knell came during the First Barbary War of 1801 to 1805, after American ships and sailors were captured and enslaved, especially the frigate USS Philadelphia, a great prize for the pirates. The war started with the Americans not paying tribute to the piratical rulers of the North African Barbary states of Algiers, Tunis, Morocco, and Tripoli. And President Thomas Jefferson himself, he had taken enough. The Philadelphia was burned in a daring raid led by Stephen Decatur in 1804, an action which also saw U.S. Marines and mercenaries marching from Egypt capture Tripoli, and see our video on the white slave trade and Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon's mission. This event stopped the expansion of the Barbary pirate kidnapping operations into northern Europe and halted the pirates from attacking American ships following the peace treaty. They also liberated many Americans and Europeans being held captive, mostly for ransoms. The Second Barbary War of 1815 to 1816 ended after an attack by the British and Dutch in 1816, which saw more than 4,000 Christian slaves being liberated, and the power of the Barbary pirates was finally broken. So basically, John Ward was effectively the godfather of the Barbary maritime slave trade, greatly expanding their capabilities. He was one of the few pirates who lived a long life, kept his wealth, and escaped the bloody end that met most pirates. He was as skilled at diplomacy as he was at sea warfare, but the legend of John Ward is still filled with gaps and full of mystery. When most of the famous pirates in history ended at the end of a noose or died on the ocean, Ward retired in wealth and luxury, and few people today even know of him. Ward had transformed and reinvented himself, growing up a poor illiterate fisherman and lowly English sailor into a highly skilled and feared Muslim pirate. It was said that he mastered reading and writing several languages, including Arabic. Modern-day theorists suggest that he was the inspiration for the character of Captain Jack Sparrow. It is also believed that he inspired Daniel Defoe's and Lord Byron's tales of romanticized pirates. But John Ward wasn't just a pirate. He was a chameleon, navigating religion, politics, and power in an age when few survived the seas. And he did what no pirate was supposed to do. He won.
Following the end of the American Revolution, it was decided that the United States needed a permanent standing army rather than a group of hastily gathered militias, but equally critical was a standing navy. The creation of the Continental Navy, as well as the Marine Corps and Army, had proven necessary to secure freedom from Great Britain, but the future was very uncertain. The Americans knew that they would never be able to compete with the major European powers with regard to massive fleets numbering hundreds of warships. In addition, the building of the great ships of the line was not considered feasible. What was considered most logical was a small fleet of frigates, also called fourth and fifth raters, ships that were fast enough to outrun and outmaneuver the more heavily armored European battleships, but powerful enough to hold their own and defeat the frigates of other nations, and a lot of thought went into their design. What decisions were made regarding the construction of frigates? Why was American warship building the envy of the world? What made American frigates so successful? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. President George Washington and other prominent Americans in government who celebrated the birth of our new country knew that there could be no resting on those laurels. Problems arose in Europe yet again, and piracy in the Mediterranean Sea and Caribbean Sea threatened American maritime trade. See our video on the white slave trade in North Africa as an example. The British were attacking American vessels and kidnapping seamen, and the French had started the same practice. In reaction to the growing global concerns, the Naval Act of March 10, 1794 provided $688,888.82, equivalent to about $18.5 million today, to finance the building of 6 frigates, 4 ships to carry 44 guns and 2 ships to carry 36 guns, respectively. The Act also provided the recruitment and salaries for naval officers, sailors, and Marines, and outlined how each ship should be manned in order to operate them. The well-known shipbuilder Joshua Humphreys is credited as the designer of the 6 frigates, but Revolutionary warship captains John Foster Williams, John Barry, and shipbuilders Josiah Fox and James Hackett were also consulted. Humphreys wisely decided on using the most durable and readily available materials available for building the ships, using primarily white pine, longleaf pine, white oak, and, most importantly, southern live oak. Live oak was used for framing as it was strong, dense, and long-lasting, weighing up to 75 pounds per cubic foot, and it grows primarily in coastal areas of the United States from Virginia to Texas, with the most suitable timber found in the coastal areas of Georgia near St. Simon's Island. Ironically, this requirement for live oak was the primary cause of delays in the frigate's construction. The War Department hired shipbuilder John T. Morgan to procure the live oak in sufficient quantities. Captains John Barry, Richard Dale, and Thomas Truxton's 1794 prediction that, quote, "Building these frigates of live oak will certainly be a great savings to the United States, as we are well satisfied that their frames will be perfectly sound half a century hence, and it is very probable they may continue so for a much longer period." Oak and pine had long been used in building ships for centuries, and there were many diverse types of those trees. Oak, being one of the sturdiest hardwoods, was the chosen material by the Europeans, hence the depletion of many trees over the centuries to allow for continued construction. One of the great reasons why Britain wanted to retain the American colonies was due to the abundance of wood for ship construction for the Royal Navy, as well as wood for sale abroad as an export commodity. The use of southern live oak in the building of the original 6 frigates of the new United States Navy can be found in the order to procure the most durable wood in the world, the live oak of Georgia. Building the new U.S. Navy in the 1790s was paramount. As early as 1799, the federal government had passed the Federal Timber Purchasers Act, which included the purchase of Blackbeard's and Grover's Islands for the express purpose of maintaining live oak reserves for the exclusive use of the Navy. The name live oak comes from the fact that evergreen oaks remain green and live throughout winter, when other oaks are dormant and leafless. The name is used in North America, where evergreen oaks are widespread in warmer areas along the Atlantic coast, from southeast Virginia to Florida, west along the Gulf Coast to Louisiana and Mexico, and across the southwest to California. Because live oak trees have a short height and low-hanging branches, the lumber was used in curved parts of the frame, such as knee braces, which are single-piece L-shaped braces that spring forward from the side and support the deck, in which the grain runs perpendicular to structural stress, making for exceptional strength. Because the trees grow in water, the wood is naturally saturated, creating a dense cellulose fiber that is strong, yet also flexible, allowing for reduction in friction in high seas or battle, where the stress is better distributed along the length of the ship. This allows the joists to flex back without splintering or shattering under intense pressure due to its strength and energy absorption, such as from cannonballs and heavy seas. Live oaks were not used for planking because the curved and often convoluted shape of the tree did not lend itself to being milled to planking of any length. This was where white pine was used, which hardens as it ages and has great resistance to water and weather. The U.S. Navy's first fleet of frigates would be powerful enough to engage any frigates of the French or British navies, yet they were also fast enough to evade any ship of the line, and the abundance of live oak and white pine ensured a large supply for future ships. Another benefit to using live oak was the ship's armament. Frigates of the day generally carried 18-pounders, cannons so named for the weight of the cannonballs they fired, and they were heavy. European-built frigates were mostly armed with these cannons. Only ships of the line carried heavier cannons of the 24 to 36-pounder variety. However, because live oak was used, 24-pounders, much heavier than the 18-pounders, could be used in the new frigates as their construction allowed for the weight without sacrificing strength or speed. These heavier guns had greater range and firepower. The designs were also revolutionary for their time, and these frigates had the ability to overpower other frigates, but they were quite capable of superior speed to escape from the ships of the line, and sometimes carried as many as 100 guns. The design was most unusual for the time, a departure from traditional frigate designs seen in Europe. These ships had deeper drafts, were longer on the keel, and narrower on their beam or width. By framing the ship with a diagonal scantling or rib scheme aimed at limiting hogging, this gave the ships extremely heavy hull planking. The hull had far greater strength than the hulls of other Navy's frigates. This increased strength also allowed for the addition of taller masts and more sails, adding speed. Live oak built the frames and hulls of the first 6 frigates: USS Constellation, built by David Stoddard in Baltimore, Maryland; USS President, built by Christian Berg in New York; USS Constitution, built by George Claghorn in Boston; USS Philadelphia; and USS Chesapeake, built by Josiah Fox in Gosport, Virginia; USS United States, built by Joshua Humphreys in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania; and USS Congress, built by James Hackett in Kittery, Maine. The most famous of these frigates, as well as the only survivor, is the USS Constitution. Today she is maintained in the Charlestown Navy Yard, National Parks of Boston. The Constitution is a living example of the genius of her construction. Her hull is built of inner and outer white oak horizontal planking with live oak vertical framing sandwiched in between, adding strength. The live oak frames are bolted together in pairs, or braces, and just a few inches of space between each pair for the air to circulate. At the waterline, Constitution's hull is over 22 inches thick, like the other frigates built. The Constitution earned the nickname Old Ironsides during the War of 1812 after the famous battle against HMS Guerriere. Of the 6 original frigates, the USS President was the 7th that was finished and prepared for war. The British gunners and American sailors both observed that the enemy shot which struck the hull of the Constitution bounced off the thick oak sides. The Constitution is the most famous U.S. frigate due to her actions during the War of 1812, when she captured numerous British merchant ships and 5 warships: the aforementioned HMS Guerriere, HMS Java, HMS Pictou, HMS Cyane, and HMS Levant. The British had taken note of the rugged nature of what they called Yankee-built frigates. After the War of 1812, British attorney and naval historian William James took note of the incredible durability of the U.S. frigates, in particular USS President, which the British captured. James wrote, "The relative stoutness of topsides cannot be fully expressed by feet and inches, for, while the timbers of the American 44, are placed as close together as they can be, there is a considerable space between each timber of the British 38. About 3 inches below the main deck port sills, the President's sides are 22 inches through. In fact, an American warship of war is almost a bed of timber. USS President was a 44-gun frigate like Constitution and, as stated, was the last to be completed and launched from New York City on April 10, 1800, with Captain Thomas Truxton in command. She departed for patrols during the Quasi-War on August 5th and recaptured several American merchant ships. After the peace treaty, she returned to the United States in March 1801. In May 1801, USS President sailed under the command of Richard Dale for service in the First Barbary War, arriving off the coasts of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, capturing a Greek vessel with Tripolitan soldiers aboard, and participating in a prisoner exchange. She returned to the United States with freed American sailors on April 14, 1802, and then returned for a second patrol on the Barbary coast in 1804 under the command of Samuel Barron. She joined USS Congress, Constellation, and Constitution on patrol, but President experienced a mostly uneventful tour, assisting in the capture of 3 vessels, performing blockade duties, and undergoing 2 changes of commanding officers. She sailed for home on July 13, 1805, carrying with her many sailors released from captivity in Tripoli after Marine Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon's capture of Tripoli, and again see our video on the white slave trade and that operation. On May 16, 1811, in what became known as the Little Belt Affair, USS President, under the command of Captain John Rogers, mistakenly identified HMS Little Belt as the frigate HMS Guerriere, which had attacked American ships to kidnap sailors for service in the Royal Navy. What happened was disputed by both sides, but both ships discharged cannon for several minutes before Rogers determined that Little Belt was a much smaller ship than Guerriere. Little Belt suffered serious damage and 31 killed aboard or wounded during the battle. Rogers offered assistance to Little Belt's captain, Arthur Bingham, but he declined and sailed off for Halifax, Nova Scotia. The U.S. and Royal Navy investigations each determined the other ship to be responsible for the attack, increasing tensions leading up to the War of 1812. After the ship spent a year blockaded in port, Stephen Decatur assumed command of President. On the evening of January 14, 1815, President headed out of New York Harbor but ran aground, suffering some damage to the copper-plated hull used to prevent barnacle growth, but her strong construction prevented a catastrophe. Unable to return to port, USS President was forced to head out to sea. Later the next afternoon, she fought a battle with HMS Endymion. Decatur attempted to capture Endymion to replace President, but this plan failed because Endymion was smaller and more maneuverable. Decatur surrendered his ship to Endymion only to sail away under the cover of night. Subsequently, HMS Pomona and HMS Tenedos overtook President, and Decatur surrendered the ship once again to Endymion. USS President was taken into the Royal Navy as HMS President, but served only briefly before being broken apart in 1818. After the war, Royal Navy officer John Cunningham was also extremely impressed by the construction of the 44-gun frigate USS United States. He noted in his journal after visiting in 1824, "The States is a tremendous frigate, and what may be called a bed of timber. Her scantling throughout is considerably above that of the Cambridge, an 80-gun Royal Navy ship of the line, according to actual measurement. Her sides are thicker by several inches. They told me that during her late repairs, a quantity of the Macedonian shot were taken out of her sides which had not penetrated." The United States was built in Philadelphia, launched in May 10, 1797, and commissioned on July 11, 1797. On October 25, 1812, the United States fought and captured the frigate HMS Macedonian, which was referenced. The British ship had fired over 100 cannonballs as well as grape and chain shot to damage rigging and increase American casualties, but nothing penetrated the hull all the way through. In fact, British cannonballs had been trapped by up to 12 inches into the hull without any structural damage to the United States. The USS Constellation was built in Baltimore and launched on September 7, 1797. On February 9, 1799, she made history when she fought and captured the French frigate Insurgente. This was the first major victory by an American-designed and built warship. In February 1800, Constellation fought the French frigate Vengeance. Although Vengeance was not captured or sunk, she was so severely damaged that her captain intentionally grounded the ship to prevent her from sinking to save his crew. The USS Chesapeake was originally planned as a 44-gun ship, but when her construction began in 1798, Josiah Fox altered the original design plan, resulting in a ship carrying only 36 guns. Fox's reason for changing the design is not clear, but may be attributed to construction materials that were diverted to complete Constellation. On June 22, 1807, the Chesapeake Leopard affair occurred when the USS Chesapeake was fired upon by HMS Leopard for refusing to comply with a demand to permit a search for deserters from the Royal Navy. After several quick broadsides from Leopard, to which Chesapeake replied with only one gun, the Chesapeake struck her colors. HMS Leopard refused the surrender, searched the Chesapeake, captured 4 alleged deserters, and sailed on to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Chesapeake was eventually captured on June 1, 1813 by HMS Shannon shortly after sailing from Boston, Massachusetts. Taken into Royal Navy service, she was later sold and broken up at Portsmouth, England in 1820, and many of her timbers were used to build a watermill. But the British inspected her design and saw the strength of her hull and the solid nature of the ship's framing. USS Congress herself carried 38 guns and was launched on August 15, 1799 from Portsmouth Naval Shipyard under the command of Captain James Seaver for her first voyage on January 6, 1800 to the East Indies. The ship's masts were destroyed in a storm, forcing her return to port for 6 months of repairs. Congress sailed again on July 26 for the West Indies and made uneventful patrols through April 1801. During her career, she captured many merchant ships, but never had a stellar combat career. The U.S. Navy continued to expand after the War of 1812 and still required ready access to live oak for repairs and building. There was also competition from civilian shipbuilders, such as the clipper shipbuilders, who also wanted to use live oak in their building. The need was so crucial that President Andrew Jackson, and see our video on him, knew that Europeans were coming into southern shores to steal live oak, especially the British. They had studied the American ships and admired the solid and rugged construction using live oak, which they did not have. As a result, he made it punishable by death for foreigners if they were caught harvesting the trees, and also harsh punishment for Americans who cut down the trees without license. In fact, the demand for live oak secured the first naval live oak plantation for the cultivation of the valuable wood in 1828, the Santa Rosa Peninsula near Deer Point in Pensacola, Florida. The purchase was just in time, for as Pensacola Congressman Joseph M. White noted in 1831, USS Constitution was in danger of succumbing to decay without a ready supply of live oak for repairs. His actions secured live oak for the nation. Luckily, the USS Constitution was preserved for history as an example of superior American shipbuilding. She was used as a training ship for decades until converted into a museum. Also in 1831, Judge H.M. Breckinridge wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy where he stated some facts in relation to the live oak, which nearly 100 years later had a profound effect on the long-term preservation of USS Constitution. Until the age of iron ships, live oak was the most valuable wood in the nation. According to the Live Oak Society, the oldest southern live oak is believed to be the Seven Sisters oak located in Mandeville, Louisiana, with an estimated age of 500 to 1,000 years, and another is Angel Oak in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, which is determined to be about 1,000 years old as well. Mutiny at sea was the ultimate betrayal, an act so rare and dangerous it could shatter empires and seal a sailor's fate in blood. In the age of sail, discipline held ships together through storms, starvation, and isolation, enforced by captains who wielded absolute power. Yet beneath the surface of every voyage simmered tension, hunger, punishment, homesickness, and pride. The 1789 mutiny aboard the HMS Bounty wasn't just a revolt against a commander. It was a rebellion against the brutal machinery of empire itself. But was Captain William Bligh truly the tyrant history remembers, or has his legacy been twisted by myth, mutineers, and the men left behind?
The 1935 film Mutiny on the Bounty, starring Clark Gable as the rebellious junior officer Fletcher Christian and Charles Lawton as the ship's captain, Lieutenant William Bligh, presented the story of the crew aboard a Royal Navy ship, the HMS Bounty, that mutinied against their cruel and abusive captain. There were remakes in 1962 starring Marlon Brando as Christian and Trevor Howard as Bligh, and then again in 1984 with Mel Gibson as Fletcher Christian and Anthony Hopkins as William Bligh. Each provided their own slant on the story. But this is where fact and fiction become blurred. History can be distorted and even misinterpreted. The history lesson people receive through film and literature is not always accurate regarding historical events. Regarding the Bounty, here are the facts. Were the various film depictions accurate? Was Captain Bligh really a cruel and sadistic man? Were Fletcher Christian and the crew justified in their revolt? What happened to all parties afterward? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Few people in naval history have a name as infamous as William Bligh, who had a long, interesting, and well-documented career. Life in any navy in the 18th century was hard, but in the Royal Navy, it was often brutal. Ship captains were judge, jury, and executioner if required. Punishments were draconian, often crippling if not lethal. Executions were not that uncommon, and the degree and severity of punishment, even for minor offenses, was at the sole discretion of the captain. Bligh, in comparison to his contemporaries, was not considered a harsh disciplinarian, as he was not a flogger, and the punishment books of his various commands show fewer and less severe punishments than most meted out in his time. Bligh served under the legendary Captain James Cook prior to assuming command of the Bounty, and Cook was well known to be a consistently harsh disciplinarian who once had a man flogged for failing to salute. But Bligh and even Cook were considered rather lenient commanders in the fleet. In fact, despite popular myth, Bligh could not have flogged any man, as he did not have the rank and he was not commissioned as a ship's master despite being in command. This was manifested when the crew of the HMS Hermione, under the command of one Captain Hugh Piggott, revolted as a result of harsh punishment. Many of the men were pressed seamen, kidnapped from towns and other ships to serve against their will. They were still subject to the laws of the sea and the whims of even sometimes brutal captains like Piggott, some who enjoyed inflicting pain and terror. Flogging with the infamous cat-o'-nine-tails was the usual punishment. On one occasion, a man was keel-hauled for theft and died as a result. As for Piggott, he was described as one of the most cruel and oppressive captains belonging to the Royal Navy. Even those in the Admiralty in London, themselves former ship captains, often took a dim view of Piggott's methods. Bligh was not that type of officer, but he did have a problem within various ships. He was not always consistent with punishment, and the infractions often ranging from minor to serious, although he never flogged, never keel-hauled, and he did place men on bread and water for extended periods of time or added watch duties. Bligh, who would eventually fall prey to a total of 3 mutinies in his career, was still an oppressive commander who insulted subordinates. Despite not being ruthless like some other captains, his lack of consistency in administering punishment often led to his crew losing faith in his command ability, and, as a result, he became widely disliked in the service. HMS Bounty left Portsmouth, England, on December 23, 1787, on an expedition to Tahiti to gather breadfruit plants for transportation to plantations in the Caribbean islands, primarily Jamaica and the Bahamas. The discovery of breadfruit in 1769 on the island of Tahiti by the aforementioned world-famous Captain James Cook on board the HMS Endeavour opened up a new agricultural product in the British West Indies and Southern American colonies. This became very critical after Britain lost the colonies in the American Revolution. Botanist Sir Joseph Banks, who had sailed with Cook and knew Bligh, was named President of the Royal Society in 1778. Banks concluded that breadfruit might fill the sudden gap in the diet of English slaves working the sugar plantations of Jamaica and the Lesser Antilles. Support for an expedition to Tahiti to retrieve and transplant breadfruit to the Caribbean was successful due to the efforts of Banks, who constantly pushed the idea, and in 1787 he successfully petitioned King George III to sponsor the effort. William Bligh was recommended by Banks, and he was chosen to command Bounty, as he had served as executive officer under Cook with Banks on the previous voyage. William Bligh's career at sea had been remarkable. At age 22, he was appointed sailing master of the HMS Resolution, captained by James Cook. After rounding the Cape of Good Hope, the Resolution spent a year exploring the Pacific from the southern islands to the Arctic North. In the Sandwich Islands, which we today call Hawaii, Bligh witnessed Cook being beaten to death on the beach by natives, a shocking event which might have powerfully shaped his own ideas about discipline. By 1786, Bligh commanded his first ship, the HMS Britannia, and this was where he met 23-year-old Fletcher Christian. On August 20th, 1787, Lieutenant Bligh took command of the Bounty. When he began to outfit and man the ship, one of the first persons he recruited was Fletcher Christian. Bligh planned to sail the Bounty west around Cape Horn, also called the Straits of Magellan, at the tip of South America, to fulfill his personal ambition to circumnavigate the globe. After 31 days, the attempt to round the Cape failed due to harsh weather, and he risked losing his ship. Bligh then decided to take the longer eastern route around the Cape of Good Hope at South Africa, into the Indian Ocean across to the Pacific. The Bounty reached Cape Town on May 24th, where it remained for 38 days as it was completely overhauled and resupplied. Bligh wrote in his ship's diary, "Perhaps a voyage of 5 months, which I have now performed without touching at any one place but Tenerife, in the Canary Islands, has never been accomplished with so few accidents and such health among seamen in a like continuance of bad weather." During the difficult months at sea and the layover on the Cape, Bligh and Christian remained on good terms. The Bounty was ready and left to continue the mission. 7 weeks later, the Bounty anchored at Adventure Bay off the southern coast of Tasmania. When the shore party landed was when the trouble started. Bligh criticized ship's carpenter William Purcell for cutting poor quality billets of wood. Purcell responded that Bligh just came on shore to find fault and became so insolent that Bligh ordered him back to the ship. Bligh knew that he was very short-handed and he could not afford to confine or put Purcell on trial for refusing orders. Purcell knew the limitations of Bligh's legal authority regarding punishment given his rank and commission, and he did not stop his insubordination towards Bligh. James Morrison, boatswain's mate, wrote that at Adventure Bay were sown seeds of eternal discord between Lieutenant Bligh and the carpenter, and it would be no more than true to say with all the officers in general. During the stay at Adventure Bay, tensions rose, especially after the first death occurred. Able seaman James Valentine contracted a mysterious sickness and was bled by the ship's surgeon, Dr. Thomas Huggin. This was a usual medical practice. This resulted in an infection, which led to Valentine's high fever, delirium, and death. Bligh blamed Valentine's death on the incompetence of Huggin and the indifference of officers whom he believed should have spotted Valentine's symptoms earlier. After a full 10-month journey, the Bounty arrived in Tahiti in October 1788 and remained there for more than 5 months due to the typhoon season, where the crew enjoyed a more relaxed and far less chaotic life, enjoying the comfortable climate and warm hospitality of the Tahitians. This was when Fletcher Christian fell in love with a Tahitian woman named Muatawa. In January 1789, 3 crew members, Charles Churchill, John Millward, and William Muspratt, deserted and stole gunpowder, muskets, and ammunition. Bligh ordered the tribal chiefs to return the men and supplies or suffer the consequences. The men were recaptured and subjected to repeated lashings, but not with the cat-o'-nine-tails, which was beyond Bligh's legal authority and placed in irons. But they were grateful that Bligh said he would not recommend them for a court-martial, which could have resulted in their hanging. On April 4, 1789, the Bounty departed Tahiti with its store of 1,015 breadfruit saplings. Many of the men did not want to leave paradise, and that was the source of resentment. On April 11th, Master John Fryer recorded and testified later at trial that Bligh and Christian argued bitterly. According to Fryer, around midnight on April 21st, Christian complained to Bligh, "Sir, your house is so bad that I cannot do my duty with any pleasure. I have been in hell for weeks with you." After the theft of an anchor grappling by natives and some missing coconuts, Bligh accused Christian. Bligh then cut the sweet potato rations in half for the crew. On April 28, near the island of Tonga, Christian and 25 petty officers and seamen seized the ship in the infamous mutiny. Bligh described what happened in the pre-dawn hours of April 28th. Just before sunrising, Mr. Christian, with the master-at-arms, gunner's mate, and Thomas Burkett, seaman, came into my cabin while I was asleep, and seizing me, tied my hands with a cord behind my back and threatened me with instant death if I spoke or made the least noise. Christian and his conspirators believed that Bligh and his 18 loyal crewmen would die after they were placed in a 23-foot open, overcrowded, and overloaded lifeboat during the voyage from the vicinity of Tafoa to Timor with very limited provisions, which included twine, canvas, lines, sails, a 20-gallon cask of water, 150 pounds of bread, a tool chest, a compass, 4 cutlasses, and a small quantity of rum. Bligh's navigational and mathematical skills were later demonstrated after the mutiny. By his remarkable seamanship, Bligh and his men reached Timor in the East Indies on June 14, 1789, after a voyage of about 3,600 miles. Bligh returned to England, and the subsequent court-martial, routine in cases where captains lose ships, found him innocent of any wrongdoing. The nation hailed Bligh as a hero, and within a year he was appointed captain of a new breadfruit expedition, this one with a full complement of lieutenants and marines for better security. This remarkable story of survival became legendary in the Navy. Fletcher Christian was certainly no honorable hero, because if he were, then he would have joined Bligh and the others in the lifeboat. The fact that he didn't supports the allegation of him leading the mutiny. But what happened to the mutineers? Christian and his men arrived on the island of Tubuai, and they attempted to establish a small colony for themselves. When that failed, the Bounty sailed north to Tahiti, and 16 crewmen decided to stay there, despite the risk of capture by British authorities. They faced hanging when caught. Christian and 8 others, together with 6 Tahitian men, a dozen Tahitian women, and a child, decided to continue searching the South Pacific for a safe haven. In January 1790, the Bounty settled on Pitcairn Island, an isolated and uninhabited volcanic island more than 1,000 miles east of Tahiti. In the summer of 1790, Captain Edward Edwards assumed command of the 24-gun frigate HMS Pandora, with orders to sail to the Pacific and recapture the mutineers. He did capture several, but on Australia's Great Barrier Reef, the Pandora ran aground and broke up. 31 crew members and 4 of the 14 prisoners went down with the ship. The other 10 prisoners, scattered among 4 lifeboats, eventually reached Kupang and finally England in March 1792, where 3 were later hanged on October 29, 1794. Bligh's reputation further suffered at the hands of Fletcher Christian's family after some of the Bounty's crew were returned to England for court-martial. Bligh swore that all those returned were equally guilty, but the court acquitted a couple of them on the basis of testimony of others that they had not participated in the actual mutiny and had in fact asked to be allowed to leave with Bligh in the already overloaded boat. Fletcher Christian had not been captured and returned to England, but the fact that some had been acquitted opened to his family the possibility that he, too, might be acquitted if he were to ever be returned to England, and this was when they began destroying Bligh's reputation as best they could. This became a much easier task due to another mutiny. The information that the Christian family provided to anyone who would listen regarding Bligh, despite their having no first-hand knowledge, became the accepted story. Bligh himself was at sea and unable to personally challenge the smear campaign. That image of Bligh, his character and demeanor, which was exaggerated, still exists today in popular literature and film. But if it were all true, the HMS Bounty would probably never have reached Tahiti in the first place. Regarding Fletcher Christian, he remains an enigma to many. Bligh was certainly no Hugh Pigot, and according to testimony, there was no actual justification for the mutiny. The most intriguing part of the story was that Bligh had actually handpicked Christian to be his executive officer due to his stellar record and capabilities. So what made Christian and the others mutiny? One may only speculate, but the fact that they probably sought a more relaxed and peaceful life outside the Navy with the women in Tahiti may have been a catalyst, and an officer like Bligh would not have abandoned his duty and mission. In 1808, an American whaling vessel was drawn to Pitcairn by smoke from a cooking fire. The Americans discovered a community of children and women led by John Adams, the sole survivor of the original 9 mutineers. According to Adams, after settling on Pitcairn, the colonists had stripped and burned the Bounty, and internal strife and sickness had led to the death of Fletcher Christian and all the others. In 1825, a British ship arrived and formally granted Adams amnesty, and he served as patriarch of the Pitcairn community until his death in 1829. In 1831, the Pitcairn Islanders were resettled on Tahiti but became rather unsatisfied with life there, so they returned to their native island. In 1838, the Pitcairn Islands, which includes 3 nearby uninhabited islands, was incorporated into the British Empire. By 1855, Pitcairn's island's population had grown to nearly 200 people, and the 2-square-mile island could not sustain its residents, and they began to starve. In 1856, the islanders were removed to Norfolk Island, a former penal colony nearly 4,000 miles to the west. However, less than 2 years later, 17 of the islanders returned to Pitcairn, followed by more families in 1864. Today, just a few dozen people live on Pitcairn Island, and just a few are descendants of the mutineers. Today, about 1,000 residents of Norfolk Island, which is about half the population, are descendants of Fletcher Christian and 8 other British sailors, the final legacy of the mutiny that made history, for better or worse.
Throughout history, there have been scoundrels willing to rob others on the high seas. These people, known as pirates, mainly targeted ships, though some also launched attacks on coastal towns. Pirates have existed since ancient times, threatening the trade routes of the ancient Greeks and seizing cargoes of grain and olive oil from Roman ships. The most far-reaching pirates in early medieval Europe were the Vikings. Though pirates have existed since ancient times, the golden age of piracy was in the 17th and early 18th centuries. During this time, more than 5,000 pirates were said to be at sea. Many of the most famous pirates had a terrifying reputation, and they displayed this by flying a gruesome flag, including the Jolly Roger, with its picture of a skull and crossbones. Captives were brutally made to walk the plank or were thrown overboard. Famous pirates from this period include Henry Morgan, William Kidd, and the fearsome Edward Teach, also known as Blackbeard. However, there was a pirate greater than all the aforementioned pirates combined, and that pirate was a woman. So how did a former sex slave become known as the Pirate Queen? How big was her fleet? And whatever happened to her? Let's try and find out.
Hello, I'm Mike Droberg, a Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker, and we will try to answer these questions on today's episode of Forgotten History. Ching Shih was a former sex worker who married into the pirate life. While pirates like Blackbeard could boast a handful of ships and hundreds of men, Ching Shih commanded an entire armada, with more sailors than most nations could muster, and because of that, she was not afraid of the Chinese Imperial Navy. For nearly a decade, Ching Shih either shared power or outright controlled the South China Sea, no matter what the Qing Emperor thought. At the height of her power, she commanded 400 ships with an estimated 40,000 to 80,000 men. But before she ruled as the Pirate Queen, she had a much humbler life. At a time when the U.S. Navy was barely a thought, Ching Shih was born as Shi Yang from the Tanka family and lived and worked on Chinese sailing ships known as junks along the coast of China. As a young woman, she worked in the brothels, gambling houses, in the boats of the Guangdong. However, her life changed dramatically at the age of 26 when she married the notorious pirate Zheng Yi in 1801. Her new husband's pirate fleet was already impressive, but it became an armada under her shared command. In 1802, Zheng's cousin, a pirate in his own right, was killed by the Vietnamese. Zheng had to take control of his cousin's pirate fleet, and with Ching Shih's smart business sense and organizational skills, the fighting among the pirates didn't last long. She played a key role in brokering peace among the leaders of various pirate groups, forming one unified confederation. The pirate navy consisted of 6 fleets, each with its own colored flag: red, black, blue, white, yellow, and purple. Together, Zheng and Shih commanded the largest fleet, the Red Flag Fleet. By 1806, every seagoing vessel in the region paid tribute to them for protection. All was well for the couple until Zheng was either killed in the storm or also killed by the Vietnamese. It was then when Ching Shih took over. Ching Shih would then marry Zheng's adopted son, Cheong Pao Sai, who was supposed to inherit his father's command. With this marriage, Shih took control of the Red Flag Fleet. Her first act was to implement a code of conduct that ensured discipline among the pirates, effectiveness in combat, and above all else, success and riches from the loot. Shih's code of conduct was as follows. Only Ching Shih could authorize an attack. Unsanctioned attacks were punished by beheading. Loot was to be gathered by superiors and distributed equally. Punishment for the first infraction was a severe beating. Repeat offenders were beheaded. Ears were cut off for those who deserted their post. The second time they deserted, they were beheaded. Rape was punished by beheading, and consensual sex without Ching Shih's permission was cause for beheading. Pirates had to marry female prisoners, and cheating on your new spouse or treating her poorly was punished by beheading. So if you couldn't tell, she really liked beheadings as a deterrent and punishment. On top of earning protection money from shipping, Ching Shih had raided coastal villages and kidnapped foreign officials for ransom. It was actually because one of these hostages, Richard Glasspool, who was held for 4 months, that we know much of anything about Ching Shih's infamy. In 1808, the Chinese Qing government had enough of the piracy and decided the time had come to take out Ching Shih's Red Flag Fleet because she had been a continual thorn in the side of commerce for years. The Qing Emperor gathered a massive fleet of warships and set a trap for them. However, instead of running away to a safer place when faced with a larger army, Ching Shih bravely sailed straight towards the government forces. After the battle, the Red Flag Fleet had destroyed many enemy ships, about half of the Qing Navy, and even captured a few dozen ships to bring back with them. Her pirates defeated a 35-ship flotilla under the command of Ling Guang off the coast of Shenzhen. Another government force under Sun Quanmo attacked with 100 ships, only also to be defeated. After the naval disaster of 1808, the Chinese government asked foreign navies for help. In September of 1809, at the Battle of Tiger's Mouth, the Red Flag Fleet faced down a joint Chinese-Portuguese battle fleet that tried to bottle up her forces in the Tung Chung Bay. For 3 months, the blockading Portuguese attempted to destroy her ships. She took some pretty heavy losses, but sailed away with her pirate force largely intact in the end. But Ching Shih understood that the government would keep harassing her fleet, so she decided to use her influence to strike a deal when her enemies were most vulnerable. She negotiated to have herself and her sailors pardoned, kept a large sum of her money, claimed the title of nobility, and was permitted to keep a small flotilla of ships and sailors. The life that began in poverty and slavery ended in fame and prosperity. She died at the age of 69 as the owner of her own gambling house in Guangdong, widely respected and remembered for her exploits on the South China Sea.
Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any comments or show ideas, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.